Unlike other taxes, corrected taxes do not cause a reduction in the total surplus. If what we remember is the total surplus is what we're looking for. In fact, they increase the economic well-being by forcing decision makers to take into account the cost of all other resources being used when they're making all these decisions. So let's look at gasoline taxes. Why are gasoline taxes so heavily? In the United States, almost half of what drivers pay for gasoline at the pump goes to taxes. Therefore, the producer and the seller is only receiving half, but the other half goes to taxes. Remember how we talked about earlier too, as the tax prices goes down, more people want to put more taxes on the gas prices because we're used to paying at that price point. This is to correct the three negative externalities associated with gasoline and associated with driving. Congestion, the pollution, accidents, roads, all the other things it takes to have for a person to be able to drive that somebody has to pay for. So utilizing who is using the gas, therefore should be who should have to pay the taxes for it. Another externality, market-based, is pollution permits. Example, the EPA regulations restrict the amount of pollution that two firms can meet at 300 tons of GLOP per year. So let's say firm A wants to increase to the amount of pollution that they're producing, and firm B agrees to decrease the pollution at the same time. If firm A buys its percentage allotment from firm B, it will be able to produce more. Firm A has better ability to produce more. It may be better for them to pay to pollute more to firm B because they can make more money off of it than what the permit would cost for them to sell. Firm B can make more off of selling the permit to them than they can actually from producing and creating creating the pollution. So social welfare is increased if the EPA allows the situation. Total pollution remains the same, so there's no external effect. Both firms are doing what is willing and what's best for their company. So this trade makes it better off for everyone. If the EPA issues permits to pollute and then allow firms to sell them, this would also increase the social welfare. Firms that control pollution most inexpensively would do so by selling their permits. So, if we tradable pollution permits and corrected taxes are similar in effect, in both cases the firms must pay the right to pollute. In the case of the tax, the government basically sets the price of pollution in firms. Then they choose the level of pollution. They give the tax and that maximizes the profit. If tradable pollution permits are used, the government chooses the level of pollution for the total. This will maximize the amount of money that can be received and the tax that can be used for other purposes, and also hope to reduce the amount of emissions into pollution. Some individuals dislike the idea of allowing companies to produce the right to pollute. Economists point out that people face trade-offs. The pollution, what is being used to produce the product, is causing the pollution. Would we want to do without those products or those services? So remember in chapter 1 we talked about trade-offs. And we must decide how much we would be willing to give in exchange for there to be no pollution. Think of the products that we would not be able to have if we decided there was going to be no more pollution. Would we be willing to give up those products? At what price or what externality would we give up those? If the world was going to eventually overheat, how much would we give up to do away with the pollution? So remember, we're always talking about trade-offs. We're always talking about assumptions. So probably we would find an equilibrium point where the pollution was worth the products or services that were given. A clean environment can be viewed as another good that obeys the law of demand. The lower the price of environmental protection, the more the public will want. So, if we look at the problem of externalities, can sometimes be solved also through moral codes and social sanctions. If you look at the Do Not Litter campaigns or the Golden Rule, many charities have been established that deal with externalities. The government encourages private solutions by allowing decisions for charities to have contributors in the detriment of taxable income. Sierra clubs, all the different clubs that have tax-free status, scholarships that are created by universities. These parties are involved in externalities. Either the seller or the bystander or the consumer will eventually be able to enter into an agreement to correct the externality. The Coase theorem is one that we look at in Chapter 10 as well. The book defines the Coase theorem as the proportion that if a private parties can bargain without the cost of allocation of resources, they can solve the problem externally on their own. We see this a lot of times in mergers and acquisitions and stuff like that, where they're able to work together or be able to make trade agreements within themselves. We'll talk a little bit later about it in just a second. One of the examples that's in your PowerPoint is one of my favorite, and it's definitely something that economics can look into, or that we look at as we move forward. I think you'll enjoy looking at it on your PowerPoint. So if you haven't been following along, make sure you look through this one. It talks about Dick owning a dog named Spot, and he has a neighbor named Jane, who the dog is driving Jane nuts with its barking all the time. One of the possible solutions for this problem would be for Jane to pay Dick to get rid of the dog. The amount that she would be willing to pay would be equal to her valuation of the cost of the barking dog. So what would be the cost benefit for her to get rid of the dog? Dick would only agree to this if Jane paid him such an amount greater than the value he places on owning the dog. Even if Jane could legally force Dick to get rid of the Spot, another solution could occur. Dick could also pay Jane to let him keep the dog. So look through the numbers and look at the graphs. I think you'll find that one interesting. Whatever the initial distribution of the rights of the parties involved, in an externally can potentially solve the problem themselves and reach an efficient outcome where both parties are better off. Dick could try to get Jane to like the dog. That way neither one of them have to spend any money. Or Dick could get the dog from barking at night. So there's all types of solutions, but you would see. So why do private solutions not always work? Mainly because of transactional costs. The book defines transactional costs as the cost that parties incur in the process of agreeing and following through on a bargain. Coordination of all those interests and parties may be difficult, so that the bargaining breaks down. This is essentially true when the number of interested parties is large. So the bigger group that you're trying to get on the same page, the more difficult it is to get everyone to agree. Okay, so that's Chapter 10 for the most part. So let's review and let's talk about what may or may not be on your test. We definitely know that externality will be on your test. Why those externalities can make the market outcomes inefficient. The variation of government policies that are aimed at solving the problems. How people sometimes solve problems with themselves. And why private solutions to externalities sometimes do not work. We talked about that with Coase theorem. So just remember, when a transaction between a buyer and a seller directly affects a third party, the effect is called an externality. If an activity yields a negative externality, such as we talked about the pollution example with aluminum, the social optimal quality in the market is less than the equilibrium quantity. If the activity yields a positive externality, such as technology spillovers, then the social optimal quantity is greater than equilibrium quantity. Remember, too, that governments pursue various policies to try to remedy the inflections caused by externalities. Sometimes the government prevents socially ineffective activities regarding behavior. Other times externalities are extremely by using corrective taxes like we talked about. Another public policy is permits, for example, the EPA. When we talked about the government could protect the environment by issuing a limited number of pollution permits, that companies and manufacturers are allowed to pollute so much per year. So governments try to help also mainly with the educational tax. This is one of the major positive externalities, and it supports more than most people realize how much taxes actually go to education, how much we spend on education. Because education has such a great far-reaching aspect as far as helping other people, keeping them out of poverty, keeping them from committing crimes, keeping it from a cycle continuing itself. Education can do so much. That's why so many taxes go towards education. So those affected by externalities can sometimes solve problems privately, like we talked about with Dick and Jane. For instance, when another business imposes an externality on another business, the two businesses can internalize externalities and possibly merge, like we talked about earlier. According to the case theorem, if people can bargain without cost, then they can always reach an agreement in which resources are allocated efficiently. In many cases, however, reaching a bargain among the many interested parties is difficult to do. So the larger the firms, the more money is involved, the harder it is to get the case theorem to work. So I hope you've enjoyed Chapter 10, and look through your PowerPoints. Always continue to print those out. Remember that your test and your final will all come from your PowerPoints, your readings, and the lectures as well. So it all should be covered in there together. Thank you, and we'll see you in Chapter 11.